Hello and welcome to Hyper Annotations, live from Venice. And I'm now sitting here with John Gerrard, and I would like to give you a short question about what is your particular history with the Biennale? Was it the first time that you came here, and what uh, was your impression at that moment?
So I think I got to the Biennale as an art student when I was about 22, I would imagine. So that would have been about 1996. And maybe a year or two out, I'm not exactly sure. But I came to the opening knowing really nothing about this event. And I think it was a little different at that time, but what I was quite taken aback by was how open it was. I mean, I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive now, but you could walk into these very interesting openings. You would be handed a glass of wine. There would be a lot of interesting people. And as an art student, totally disconnected in Venice in mid 90s, it was really a sort of a forum. It was possible to see things, to learn things, and also to develop a network. So I kind of made a habit of coming, not necessarily to the opening after that first experience, which, as I said, was it was fun and it was interesting. And then gradually over the years, I sort of witnessed it becoming more, I guess, more elite in a sense, more professionalized in a funny way, a little bit more closed. But ironically, I was becoming a working artist, so I was able to sort of gain greater access as I think Venice became a little bit more closed. And I do wonder now, maybe you should talk to a younger visitor, maybe in their early 20s, and ask them at their experience of the accessibility of the Biennale in this week, if it's changed. But for me, I suddenly learned about the world in a very abrupt way in the mid-90s. The art world, I would say.
I'm quite interested because about how we are all professionals here, so we have a particular outlook and expectations of what the Biennale is. We already know quite few things about uh, the setup, basically. But how would we describe, or how could we describe to somebody who's never been to Biennale, has never read anything about the Venice Biennale, what it is, and not using it that history, but just how would it describe the experience of going to this ever changing conundrum.
Well, I thought about that yesterday because I chose to get a train from Vienna. So I took a 6-hour train, which actually now also involves a bus. And so I got into Tronchetto, and then I got the Vaporetto. And even after all these years, and I did a big project in Venice in '09, I lived here for a month, and I really got to know the city in a different way, which we can talk about later. But even now, after all these years, you round the corner and you see Venice. And Venice, I think, is a city, first and foremost. And part of the reason that I think the Biennale is so consistently successful as such, or if you judge success around popularity, the reason why so many people return is because it is a magical city, and it is a very historic site. I would describe of exchange. Obviously, it was built around a particular kind of trade, but in this information age, there's a different form of exchange which happens here, and it is still by far the most important art gathering, I think. I mean, some people might challenge that. I mean, maybe it's a very Western-centric approach. There's these enormous biennales in Asia and other parts of the world, but yet everybody comes here. From increasingly from the Middle East, it is less what I would say following a kind of Western European to American axis as such, which was, I think, part of its qualities at one point, particularly in mid 20th century. It was had a very particular kind of, I would call it an Anglo-American axis in a funny sense, a Euro-American axis. But so, you know, rounding the corner from Tronchetto, I just felt very powerfully that one of the great strengths of this Biennale is the city. You know, the city is embedded in the Biennale and vice versa. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's consistently so popular.
The Venice Biennale surely is something that has interaction in its own city, has changed the city. Are there some ways where you could describe like the most drastic and more positive or negative changes in this city, especially after you had a long project in this city and you were able to see the city and experience it for a longer time than other people who just come and hop here for 2 days?
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to produce a project in Venice. And one of the reasons for that is because I think the Biennale has, you could say, in the politest sense, you could say that it has summons a kind of particular sort of mercantile, a relatively aggressive economic structure in which you have groups of people coming from all over the world with, you know, budgets of different scales. And it's a competitive market for things like space, first of all. And, you know, you could end up spending, you know, 10, 20, 30,000 euros a month for space here during those times of the Biennale. And then you have another layer which is about services, you know, be it, you know, food that you wish to produce, you know, kind of acquire for, you know, all these kind of things. So I had an unusual experience in 2009 because it was an artist-led project on the island of Certosa. It was curated by Jasper Sharp, who worked for the Guggenheim in Venice for about 6 years and knew Venice very intimately. And he noticed a new Vaporetto stop he'd never seen before on the island of Certosa, I think in around 2008. And he got off there. You had to ask for it to stop Vaporetto there. And on it was an enormous boat shed, about 1,000 square meters. And in the summer, all the boats were removed and put to sea, so it was empty. And it was this new site because the Vaporetto suddenly made it accessible. And he proposed a project, and we worked together with an Irish institution, the Royal Hibernian Academy. But what was interesting about 2009 was the great economic crash happened in 2008. And our institution in particular was very badly affected in Ireland by that. So we had this incredible moment where they said, you can continue with our, you know, under the umbrella of our institution to be a collateral event of the Biennale, but you have to do this on your own. So what we did was we did a sort of a series of layers of I would say, resources coming from Vienna. Everything was kind of built in Vienna, brought by teams, Viennese teams actually coming, unloading, building this thing. There was a wave of builders, there was a wave of software and, you know, kind of equipment installers, and then a wave of people to open it. So over about a month, we had waves of people coming. And we rented a small cottage on the island, and we camped there, 20 of us in the cottage, and cooked ourselves in front, you know, for 20 people each night. So we did a really, really ambitious project very cheaply. But I think that's an unusual experience, and it might be even more unusual now. Because, as I said, I think one of the more unfortunate aspects is that very typically you come to Venice as a novice, and you are really kind of ripe for exploitation in a sense, because you need things, you don't know where they are. It's a complicated city, you know, there's a lot of water barriers, boats are phenomenally expensive. So I would say one of the sad things is just the degree to which it's a stressful place to produce an art project. And the Venetians do to a degree take advantage of that, and it becomes a major industrial transferal of money from all these art organizations around the world to the city of Venice, to the denizens of Venice, which I think can be. It got quite extreme for us on the island, you know, where literally each day was a new negotiation for trash removal or access, or but thousands of euros. And for an artist-led project, that was pretty brutal.
I'm quite interested in producing of communalities, and what you just mentioned, that you cooked for the whole, that was cooked for the whole group.
Yes.
So it's basically a gastro-political event there. Can you give me like an example, an anecdote? What happened there?
Well, it was a family affair. My partner, now husband, managed the catering, and we enlisted the help of a local teenager who had a little boat, and he would go each morning to the market with Cesar and come back literally with a boat of food. It would be unloaded, and we would cook for these teams. One of the builders was from Vienna. I think it's somebody to whom you are related. Anyway. And so I loved it because it was, as you say, a site where all the participants sat together. It was a very sort of non-hierarchical setting, and we all took turns to kind of contribute to kind of cleaning and cooking. So as a result, we did a project that I think in a normal council of events would have cost hundreds of thousands of euros. We did it relatively cheaply. I mean, we still had to raise a lot of money to do it, but it gave the project, by the time we opened, just this extraordinarily powerful sense of kind of cohesive community, which then went on to kind of produce this project, which is called Animated Scene, which, as I said, opened in 2009. We also took over, we found an abandoned cloister on the island, and I collaborated with a Belgian collector, dealer, sort of connoisseur, Axel Vervoet, and we renovated it to do a big dinner, which we picked up on these themes of monasticism, and we brought these long, very, very simple tables from Vienna and sat around 150 people for dinner on the opening night, and then for lunches. And there was a lot of we tried to bring people together for a sort of discursive possibility around food. We collaborated with Slow Food Venice at that time to produce the menus. And the subject of the animated scene was a dust storm from the Dust Bowl period of America, 1935. A computer-controlled pig production unit, which is contemporary on the American landscape. And early work of mine from 2008 called Oil Stick Work, where a man paints a barn over 30 years. He'll finish this work in 2038. And one last little thing, which is funny, is that Certosa is the place where people in Venice bring their boats to be repaired. It's basically a boat repair shop. But as a result, they had the most beautiful boats there, one of which we negotiated to rent. And in the end, ironically, the success of the project involved the curator and, for instance, my gallerist from New York, Simon Preston, getting in this beautiful boat, driving into the center of the Giardini on these canals. Because if you have a boat in Venice, it's access all areas, basically. So you could drive into the center of the Giardini, hopping out, loading people on, driving back, seeing the project, and then delivering them back to the Giardini. Otherwise, the issue of access is huge here. I mean, if you don't have those kind of, if you don't have that flow of people coming, you could do anything and nobody would see it, particularly if you're on an island. So.
Venice is quite an interesting city when it comes to the architecture. I mean, the history of the city is pertained to be a rebuilt Teotihuacan, because this was then the imagination of the water city, and they have like made a
rebuilt
map.
what?
Teotihuacan. Now it's called Mexico City.
Really?
Yes, they brought back a map of Teotihuacan, and then
Who brought it back?
the conquistadors.
Really?
Yes, they brought it. They brought back a map of the city back, and Venice was already a canal city. It was already an island city.
Yeah.
But Islam was a city that had technology that we have not developed in Europe since now. We had floating islands built from earth and stuff like that. So in a way, that it's a mediated city. It's a city of different informations put together by those canals, but still not interacting like a normal city that would just like enable you to walk over. So there's like these data streams that are can only be bypassed when you move over the canal.
Right.
So
that's interesting. I mean, in a funny way, another thing that I thought when I was getting the boat into Venice was that, you know, this is a city obviously emerging from trade, but also emerging from a particular kind of a type of expression of power, in a sense. And in this site in particular, it's an expression of ecclesiastical power. You know, you have multiple, I mean, just the density of powerful ecclesiastical religious structures is quite remarkable on this archipelago. And I don't think it's so accidental that, you know, Venice has been taken up by art, because in a funny way, people have to believe in something. And at this time, there's a very particular community of people who seem to believe very passionately in art as some sort of a vehicle for not just meaning, but also life in some sense. You know, it is an animating interest, you know, a globally animating interest. And then, you know, these sort of roving art events repurpose historic power structures, which were at one point ecclesiastical. I mean, if you look at Oxford, for instance, as a university city, it was historically monastic. You know, these were sites of learning, you know, with very similar structures of quadrangles and, you know, covered walkways and these kinds of things. But it is still a university. I mean, it's still about the sort of, you know, the sort of religiosity fell away, but it is still a very, very specific type of site for learning. But Venice, you know, really the kind of ecclesiastical function has, I think, for the most part, ceased. And art has filled the void. And that is, for me, one of the things that I was thinking about Venice, its relationship to ecclesiastical power, the loss of that language. And it's, I mean, in the most literal sense, it's kind of repurposing by art as a common thing for people to believe in. I mean, I'm not saying that as a definitive. I'm saying that as a sort of question.
Building a cloister, building a church, is building a place where you can experience something. You can experience your religion. And I think that also in your art, in your work, art becomes experiential. You are able to experience something. It is therefore no longer just a mere object to be placed on a wall. It transcends that. It also becomes a post object, if you want to use like.
Well, that's a compliment, thank you. But I think for your listeners, just to clarify what we're talking about. So fundamentally, I make simulations, which are pieces of software. And they are, in the most basic sense, they're virtual worlds. So you spend a lot of time and energy to produce a world. You know, it's not a record as such. I would describe the simulations that I produce as portraits, because they are not informed by the fantastical for the most part. They are real places, pig production units, for instance, which are almost so strange that they are kind of beyond the fantastical. They are in a special sort of zone of particular type of production, particular type of capitalism, particular type of sort of ecology, I would say, a kind of just a rampacious production of, in this case, meat. But just a couple of comments in relationship to what you've said. We have had a very particular history of art's relationship to the moving image as a record. You know, where do we start? I mean, let's just start relatively randomly with something like now, you know, not with film, but with video, with that sense of an immediacy to video where he gestures and he can see it on a monitor. It's not printed to film and then developed. It's this extraordinary immediacy to that. And he responded by producing these gestures, you know, foot against the wall, etc. The early gestural, almost choreographies of Naumann. But in a curious way, moving image, recorded image, which is a three-dimensional world thrown onto a two-dimensional plane, has not sort of penetrated the landscape in a funny way. It's not really penetrated the public domain. It has remained in cultural spaces. And I am a part of the dynamic of which you've described, where simulation, which is a form of world making, seems to be popular. It seems to be possible that it takes a place in the world. As an artist, I produce software, and that software is manifest as a game engine. And because of that, it has a very different temporal scale or presence than video, in that the worlds unfold over a year. So they are typically locked to a local time, and that local time is wherever the place is, the portrait of that place. But just to a little bit get back to what you said about the idea of the work as a kind of an experience, what's been happening since around about 2011, where for the first time in 2011, and there was an early engagement with this medium. Often artistic mediums are kind of co-opted by, are kind of like repurposed from advertising technologies. And in 2011, as an artist making software, I repurposed an advertising technology, which is an LED wall, and put it on the landscape in Manchester, as part of Manchester International Festival. In a sort of specific kind of way, we rear supported the LED wall, so it had no frame, and it meant that you had the city, and then you had the LED wall with showing a virtual world. And I've done that consistently. I did it at Lincoln Center in New York, I did it at Somerset House in London, and I've just most recently done it in Desert X in Palm Springs. But the reason I mention this is because I make worlds as an artist, and the sun rises in those worlds, and the sun goes down, and they unfold over a year. So what's interesting for me is that you do not see video installed in a semi-permanent way on the landscape at scale. It just doesn't happen. I don't think I've really seen it. You see night projections and you see such things. But something to do with the game engine and the simulation for my work, and this is driven by me, but also by an appetite, because it's an expensive undertaking to put an LED wall in the Coachella Valley. Somehow, the public are interested to experience a virtual world in the real world, and for the relationships between those two states or those two sites to be ambiguous, because the worlds that I make are very realistic. So there's a slippery relationship between the physical world here, the virtual world there, and the sort of changing light over months, actually, in both worlds. So if video is a record, the production of simulation involves a type of world making, and it is actually a world, three-dimensional world. And that's, I think, getting back to where we started, involves a certain experience for the public, not in cultural spaces, but on the street or in the landscape. And they can come and they can have a different relationship with media, which is not narrative driven. It's an open-ended relationship to place, in a sense.
In AI research nowadays, and also in the development of new technologies and new uh, car developments and all of that, they say that simulation is the future, meaning that uh, building something in the real takes more time and effort than to actually use simulation
Yeah.
and actually also test the potentials
Yeah.
of it breaking down, it failing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in a way, your work already pre-shadows that. It's like a dark precursor, to use the Deleuze's theory. It it also shows something before it was done in technology.
Well, I have a couple of observations about that. I mean, number one, I have three specific observations. First of all, the modeling of reality historically was a military technology. Um, you have, you know, battlefield simulations, kind of Kriegspiel type scenarios, which would be sandboxes, for instance. Heading into the mid 20th century, 60s, 70s, 80s, those are digitized and become models. You know, the simulation involves the modeling of a certain set of dynamics, and you can ask questions of that model. But very quickly, it slipped out of its usage within specifically militaristic environments, flight simulations, and moved into both entertainment, where you have virtual gaming, but I think perhaps more as potently into sites of advanced knowledge production, like physics and mathematics, where your first step in mathematics at a kind of third level or postgraduate level is to learn how to program. I mean, you must model and then ask questions of those models, which I think gets back to what you said. So one of the things that saddens me about art schools is that artists have been given a free pass when it comes to computer science because of some historic legacy that they can't think mathematically, for instance, which I think is completely incorrect. I think it's an artifact of the education within art schools that art students, as a matter of course, are not taught how to program. It must happen, actually. Not that all artists need to program, or that all art needs to be simulation, but if you're going to speak to a reality that is animated in incredibly complicated ways by modeling, you must be able to, let's say, take ownership of that language and put it to work for different purposes, for the pursuit of meaning, for the pursuit of beauty, whatever it may be. Because most of the applications of modeling culturally have to do with dominance and profit. If you look at what Google is doing, if you look at what Facebook's doing, it's about dominance and profit. So I think that instead of talking about simulation, I'd talk about modeling, and I would also strongly pose the question why art schools are not more involved in modeling reality as opposed to recording it. It's not enough to record reality now, given what's happened. And then the great game changer in the modeling of reality does emerge from neural networks, from artificial brains, from synthetic intelligence, and that is coming online very, very, very fast as we speak, transforming self-driving cars or such things. And again, art schools have to take ownership of that space, because anything that affects the real, artists must have access to. So I'd be interested to see, in Venice, we're here because of Biennale, to what degree there is really a sophisticated relationship with modeling on the one hand within the works presented and with artificial intelligences, because one of the dangers of what's happening right now is that we have almost kind of farcical applications of artificial intelligence within art. I mean, really towards image morphing in the end. I mean, that is not a function of artificial intelligence it's such a low level application to scan 20 pictures and produce an amalgam.
I see it basically as it's similar to the development of perspective, and we are still below the emergence of perspective in Renaissance art, and so we just have to wait for that gap. We have to jump over the gap until the emergence of an aesthetic that is below just mashing 50 pictures together and then having small dogs appear in
Well, it's not that we have to wait. I think we have to challenge and scrutinize the academy. Really, what's occurring in art schools now is not enough. And young students are not being equipped, I don't think, to ask the right questions of algorithmic conditions within the real. And that's not going to change until the historic singular emphasis of art schools is addressed. They must be built around collaborative structures. They must be built around complexity. They must be built around an absorption of computer science into the very structure of the academy. Everybody else has done it. And there's no good reason for art schools to get a free pass.
I completely agree with you. I really think that the emergence of Renaissance art was because of technology, because of adherence to mathematics, because art back then took in what it could from technology and knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, all art uses whatever technology is available at that time. It takes ownership of it. I mean, let's not forget paint is a technology. Pigment is a technology. We have forgotten that these are very, very sophisticated technologies. But the fact that you have a whole body of art students who only have those historic materials to work with is no longer acceptable, and I think it's actually quite dangerous.
Well, thank you for this amazing interview.
Pleasure.